Let's bring in my guest now, Richie Merzian, Climate and Energy Program Director at the Australia Institute. Let's talk about the summit at the weekend. The Prime Minister was not afforded a speaking spot. Will there be more pressure from Boris Johnson, from the UN and from the United States as we head into 2021?
It sure will. We know that President-elect Biden will host a conference within 100 days of him taking power on the 20th of January. So this will happen hot off the heels of the UN Climate Ambition Summit. But what's worse is that the Prime Minister looks isolated, not just from the usual voices in the Pacific, but from his close allies as well. Like his Conservative compatriot Boris Johnson was the co-host of the summit, and still he wasn't afforded a ticket. We're going to be seeing more conferences, more events, more international pressure.
What's the main problem?
Well, look, it was called the Climate Ambition Summit, and you need to deliver climate ambition, and that's what the Australian government didn't have. You needed to increase your target over the next 10 years. You need to have a long-term target, or you need to be putting more money on the table. In all three, Australia was falling short. What the Prime Minister did offer was not to use these dodgy Kyoto Credits. That's a good thing, but it's not good enough. And so what he did is instead he announced that in his address to the Pacific Island Forum. But at the Pacific Island Forum, Australia is a member. We get a speaking slot by default, not by merit. And so it was in a sense, a runners-up prize to be able to announce it there. And it still didn't really muster up enough encouragement when it comes to ambition.
So with the net zero commitment, that's not a binding treaty, is it? It's simply an ambition. It doesn't cost anything in the short term, does it?
It wouldn't cost the Prime Minister anything to commit to net zero by 2050. It's not going to be held legally to account. And if you think about it, every state and territory has that target. So if all your parts have that target, then it doesn't really mean too much for the federal government to then take that on as well.
So in broader terms, in terms of the climate response, where do you see the government going next year? If you had to, it's hard to predict, but they're clearly shifting. They're shifting. The Prime Minister's pragmatic leader. He knows what's happening with our two closest allies in the UK and the US. He does not want to be ostracised there. But he's got also his, sensitive internal politics to manage too. Yeah,
those loud voices in his own party to contend with. We know the government is undertaking a long-term strategy. It's doing the work. And so the expectation is they'll deliver that close to the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow late next year. Ideally, that'll be a net zero by 2050 target, much like every state in this country, if not better. I think that's the bare minimum the Prime Minister can offer right now. But the next step is actually coming up with concrete targets for each of the different areas, for electricity, for transport, for industry. In some areas like in gas and coal, for example, emissions are going up because Australia is looking to produce more fossil fuels. At the very least, he can put a cap and say no more coal mines, no more gas fields, and that would be taken quite well, especially in the region, in the Pacific, that have been asking for that.
So why are those targets in the industries and sectors important? Is it to guide investment, that sort of thing? Is that why they are welcome?
Yeah, ultimately the government leads by example, and by putting a long-term target, it's telling the business community it's not worth investing in that particular project because it'll have a shorter time frame than you think it will have because we're moving away from that. That's ultimately the real value. And there's also an order to things. First, you want to switch to 100% renewable electricity. Then you electrify everything else. You electrify transport, industry, heating and cooling. And then you go ahead and you work on how you create those offsets, those forestry projects. So there's an order to things, and the government can set that order out, get everyone on track, and really start building that local momentum.
But the low-hanging fruit at the moment is that net zero target, because while the critics of this might say, look, this is just symbolism, it doesn't mean anything, the fact is, internationally, the Prime Minister could do that and it wouldn't cost a cent.
No, it wouldn't. And also because
it's not binding. It's not a binding treaty.
It's not binding, and it's a 30-year target. So you can, in a sense, determine how quickly you get there. At the same time, people will be holding him to account. And when you look at what net zero by 2050 looks like, it might mean actually doing a lot more in the next 10 years. And so I think that's the kind of work that the Prime Minister is going to be doing. But that's going to be coming up over and over again, even locally. With Zali Steggall's bill, for example, has a net zero by 2050 target in there. And so that'll come up quickly.
And it's not just international pressure, it's local, not just independents and Labor. The Liberal Party in New South Wales, through its Minister Matt Keane, is driving really hard in this space. Do you see a scenario, and what's your information when it comes to the trade negotiations between the UK and Australia and between the EU and Australia. Is climate featuring?
It is featuring, and they still, even though the EU negotiations have been going on for at least 2 years, they still haven't nutted down the exact language around how climate change will be taken into account. We know the EU wants quite ambitious language. Australia's been pushing back. And so that is an outstanding position. It's the same thing with the UK. The UK is going to 100% electric vehicles in the next 10 years. Like, they are miles ahead when it comes to dealing with climate in all the different sectors, and they're factoring that into their trade negotiations as well. And it's also with the US. The US is looking at potentially border tariffs or finding some way to take into account climate ambition in the way that it deals with countries both economically and diplomatically.
Is that under Biden, you mean?
That is under Biden. So that's something else that we'll have to contend with. It's not, and at the same time, when it comes to our fossil fuel exports, the three countries that import the majority of Australia's coal, the majority of Australia's liquefied natural gas, they've all got net zero by 2050 or 2060 targets.
So it makes sense to be making the adjustments now, given where all of that international movement is. Are there any other nations that are in this situation right now where the ambition remains a problem for the UN, for the UK, the host of those talks next year?
Not in the developed world. Most industrialised countries are moving. Canada spoke on the weekend at this Climate Ambition Summit as well. Really, Australia is becoming more and more isolated, and that's a very awkward position to be in.
Richie Merzian from the Australia Institute, as always. Appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Pleasure.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
Wages are growing at their slower, sustained pace.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.